Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Faster Law webinar series. Today's episode is number 10, Group Policies, Sharing Your Settings. So as always, my name is Andrew Suter, and I am your host today. I provide direct support for Faster Law. If you have any questions throughout the webinar today, feel free to type them into the chat box at the bottom. You can type those questions in at any time, and I will make some time at the end of the webinar here to go back and answer any questions that you might have come up with and typed in there. All right, so episode 10, Group Policies, Sharing Your Settings. Basically, we're just going to cover how to use our firm-wide settings, or what we previously called firm-wide settings. We've made some changes to it. And we can now configure settings for the firm. We can configure settings for specific groups of people. And we can also configure our own settings, which will travel between computers when we install Faster Suite on other computers for ourselves. So the first thing we're going to cover is the Group Policies tab, which we'll find in Settings. That just basically shows us all the settings and what we can do. Then we're going to take a look at configuring groups within your firm to get specific settings loaded out to them. And then we're going to look at how to actually configure the settings for the firm or for a specific group. Today's webinar is going to be a little bit shorter than the last couple, which will be kind of nice. The last couple webinars were, probably an hour or so long. Today, I would expect maybe 30 minutes or so. So that'll be kind of nice for those of us that are pretty busy here. Not a ton of content to cover, but the changes that we made here are fairly significant, so we wanted to cover it today. But let's go ahead and jump right in. So the first thing we're going to look at is the Group Policies tab. And to get there, we're just going to click on Faster Suite on the ribbon at the top on the left-hand side. And we're going to click on Settings. And that will bring up our Global Settings window, as I'm sure you're all aware. Now, in our Global Settings window, we're going to click on Advanced on the left-hand side. And then we're going to find Group Policies across the top. So when I say Group Policies tab, this is what I'm talking about. Everything that we do with configuring settings for our firm or for specific groups happens in this window. Now, when we look at this window, the first thing you'll see at the top is Global Settings. Global settings are settings that you will configure for your entire firm. So an example of something that you would want to configure here as a global setting would be possibly like the way you name your emails when you save them using Faster Mail. Generally things like this, we would want everyone at the firm saving the emails the same way. That way we can really easily sort and filter them. If we have different people using different naming conventions here for those email files, it could just get a little bit messy. So things like that you might want to set as a setting for your firm. Anything that you want everyone at your firm doing exactly the same way. If we go back to our Group Policies tab here, the next thing we see is Group Settings. So this is where we can configure specific groups of people to receive, certain settings. Group-wide settings, we can basically set groups for, like, let's say different practice areas. Like if people in family law at your firm do things a little bit differently than the people in corporate law, you just configure two separate groups, and then you can load out settings to each of those groups at will using our group settings here. An example of something that you might want to set differently for different groups of people would be maybe like in our cloud drive, the folder organization for Faster Drive. Maybe people in family law like to look at them by status client matter. That makes the most sense. But then people in corporate law like to look at them organized by responsible attorney. And they want to use matter number instead of matter description or something like that. Something like that different groups of people might want different settings for, but everyone in that group would want the setting the same. Those things you can set, again, under Group Policies here using our group settings. So this is one of the additions that we made in this latest update. Previously, we could configure firm-wide settings, but we could not configure specific group settings. So it was either set it for everyone or everyone sets it individually. Hopefully, this will alleviate some of the work that you have to do to put in certain settings for people. I will also mention with this, global settings will override group settings. So if you have the same setting set both in your global settings and in your group settings, it will apply the group settings first, and then it will apply the global settings. So any duplicates that are in both will get overwritten with the configuration for the global setting. So just important to keep in mind. Now, below global and group, you see My Settings, and this one's just a checkbox because all of our settings we just configure, in our settings window here. But checking this box will allow you to basically, if you log on to Faster Suite on another computer, it will load whatever settings you have set here to that other computer. So anytime you log onto a computer, change your settings, go back to another computer, you don't have to go into that computer and change those settings as well. So this is another new addition in this version of Faster Suite. Really handy because previously, every time you loaded onto a new computer, you'd have to go in and reset all of your settings, which was really inconvenient. But now we can just choose to have our settings roam with us. Now, again, group settings are going to override My Settings, global over group. So the order they get applied is My Settings, then group settings, then global settings. So the top is basically the most important and overrides the others. Group settings overrides My Settings. Now, at the bottom here, we have Load Settings Now. You probably won't have to use this button here, but what it does is when we click on it, it just basically loads any settings that we have set for global or for the group that we are in. Now, if we don't click that button, Faster Suite will check every 60 minutes for global and group settings. So it should load automatically. Now, it'll check for those settings when you launch Faster Suite, and then again every 60 minutes. So one thing I'll mention with this, again, you shouldn't have to click this button. Everything should load automatically for everyone at your firm. But one thing I'll mention with that 60-minute delay, what Faster Suite is doing is, again, checking every 60 minutes. What it is not doing is locking those settings. So even if you set something as a global setting to load out to everyone at your firm, those users can come into their settings window and change those settings back. Let's say you set everyone's cloud drive to be mapped to the F drive. Someone goes in here, they can change this back to A. The next time Faster Suite checks for these settings, though, it'll just switch it back to the F drive. So people can temporarily change their settings. But again, every 60 minutes, it's just going to reload all of the settings that we've configured here. So just wanted to point that out while I was talking about the loading every 60 minutes. But you can always click this button to load settings immediately. Like if you set a bunch of settings and you want everyone at your firm to start using those settings right away, you can just tell them, go into settings and click load settings now, and that'll pull them right away instead of waiting for 60 minutes or having to relaunch Faster Suite or something like that. So that's the significance of that button there. That covers everything on this tab here, at least an explanation of what it is. Next, let's take a look at configuring specific groups to load settings for. So again, in our Group Policies tab, we're going to look at group settings in the middle here. So you'll see that the checkbox next to Use Group-Wide Settings is checked by default. That means everyone is going to be using group settings by default, but we don't actually have any groups configured yet. So if I click on this dropdown, you'll see there's nothing in there. It's just empty. What we have to do is actually set up the groups and then basically assign people to those groups. So the first thing that we do, let's just use our family law and corporate law example. We just want to set up two separate groups for those people. What we have to do is just click the plus button next to that dropdown, and that'll let us type in a name for the group. So I'll just type in family law, hit OK. There it goes on the left-hand side. Now we'll click the plus button again to add corporate law. So once I've done that, we'll see when I click the dropdown, we can select either family law or corporate law. So we've actually created those groups now, and anyone would be able to go into their settings tab to advance to group policies and then choose the group that they belong to. Now, for group settings, I would recommend being somewhat broad with these. You could technically set up a bunch of different groups for really specific things, but if it gets to the point where you are setting up a group for like every 2 to 3 people, it probably isn't worth actually setting those up as groups, and it would probably be better just to have those people go in and change those specific settings that you would set to that specific of a group themselves. It's just going to be easier that way. This would be for larger groups of people. So if there's like 8 people that should have settings all set the same way, configure a group for them, name it whatever you want. You could do practice areas. You could do maybe attorneys have their settings configured differently than paralegals. Whatever you want, you can set up any groups that you want here. So again, once we set that here, that creates the groups. It doesn't actually assign people to them. So each person that belongs to the family law group will have to go into their settings, go to advanced, go to group policies, and select family law here in order to pull those settings. One other thing that I will mention is, even though I've created these groups here, if I click Save and Close, and then go back into Settings, those groups are going to be gone. And that's because I actually didn't configure any settings for them. So when you create these groups, just make sure you go in and configure at least one setting for them. That way they will stay there even when you close out of the window. So yeah, that's fairly straightforward how we actually create the groups and assign them to people. Let's take a look at how to actually configure the settings for the firm or for specific groups. So in our Group Policies tab, you'll see that we have a couple of pencil icons, and each one corresponds with exactly what it's next to. So we can click on this pencil icon to configure global settings for our firm, or we can click on this pencil icon to configure settings for the group that we have selected from this dropdown. So for example, I could click the pencil icon, set some settings for corporate law, and then if I change this to family law, I can click the pencil icon again, and that'll open up like a different configuration window for family law. So the settings are separate, and just selecting something different under the group will change where this pencil icon goes. So I just wanted to explain that. But let's take a look at actually configuring the settings. When we click on one of these pencil icons, that will bring up our policy editor. And this window is probably going to look a little bit intimidating the first time you see it, but hopefully I'll be able to clear up a little bit of this. It's fairly intuitive once you kind of, I guess, understand it. But essentially what we see here is 3 columns. We have setting, and this is the name of each setting that we have in FasterSuite. You'll see we have a lot of them. So literally every setting in FasterSuite is listed here. And the way they're named is basically it's ripped straight out of our code. So these are our code names for each setting. They're named pretty intuitively and pretty specifically. But if you're looking at this full list here, it's kind of hard to tell exactly which setting is which, or hard to find specific settings because there are so many. So I'll cover that in just a moment, but the next column here is value. This is the value that you have set on your computer for that setting. Now, actually, before I get further into this, I will mention, before we actually configure these settings, really, really important to make sure the settings are configured on your computer and that we hit save. Basically, when we configure a firm-wide setting, it is going to load into that settings group what we have configured. So if I wanted to set a firm-wide setting for everyone to use F as their drive letter instead of A, we actually have to go to Cloud Drive, make that change on our computer, and then, and I can't stress this enough, make sure you hit save. This is probably the #1 problem that people have when configuring firm-wide settings or group settings, is they forget to hit save after changing their setting. If we don't hit save, if I change this to A and don't hit save, those settings haven't saved to our computer. They're not going to load out correctly to the group policy. So always make sure you save your settings before configuring these settings here. But now that I've mentioned that, let's go back to our policy editor. So again, the second column here, that's what this is showing, is the value of each setting. You'll notice there are a bunch that say true, false. Those are actually checkboxes. So for example, enable the Clio drive. That's a checkbox. If we found that setting over here, since that box is checked, it would show up as true. If it was unchecked, like this one down here, it would say false. So that's, I guess, how we differentiate checkboxes here, is with true and false. Now, the last column here is add to policy. So this is what we'll click in order to add the specific setting that we found to the firm policy or the group policy. Now, before we do that, though, we have to find the setting that we want. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So again, we have a big, long list of settings here. We can filter them using this box at the top. And usually, if you type in something specific, you probably won't find the setting that you're looking for. Now, I don't have a good example of this, but if I type in like letter, looking for the Cloud Drive letter, that pulls it up. But this setting could potentially have been named like Cloud Drive alphabet character or something like that, something that is not the specific term that you're looking for. So in this case, it did pull it up. And if you can pull up the setting that you're looking for with a specific search like this, that's great. If you type in letter and it doesn't find that setting, it's usually better to just use a more vague search term here. So we type in like Cloud Drive, and then we'll just get a list of all of our Cloud Drive settings. So it's going to be easier to find from this short list than the list of everything. We can then just look through here, and the best way to actually find a setting in a list like this is not to look at the setting names, but to look at the values. So again, for that Cloud Drive letter, I know that that is set to A. So if I look down the value column, I can just look for anywhere that it says A. And here we go. I look to the left, Cloud Drive, drive letter. I know that's the setting that I want. So I hit add to policy. Now, that's really good for specific things like this, where there's probably only going to be one setting with that value. Checkboxes, it's a little bit harder. And then there could also be fields with like duplicate values. So for example, if we do like, I don't remember what these settings are called. If I search custom value format, like looking for the Cloud Drive organization structure, and I just knew that's what it was called off the top of my head, format custom values, so that's what I searched. But if we look down here and we're looking through the value column, we see there are two settings that have the same value. In this case, we have to look here, look to the left, Cloud Drive matters format custom value. Yep, that's the one we want. If we found email filer first, we could come down here and say, oh, here's that value, that must be it, hit add to policy. If we were to do that without double checking the setting, we would have set the wrong setting. So just always, once you find it from the value, double check the setting name to make sure it's the one that you want. For checkboxes, another thing you can do is, let's say you want to find a Cloud Drive setting and you want to find one that is false, like this, open this location automatically after this application finishes loading. I have that set to be unchecked, so it'll show up as false in this list. Our search box here can actually search the value as well. So we just type in false, and then we get a list of all of our Cloud Drive settings that are set to false. And then we can just look through the settings here. So that setting was open this location automatically, which is this one here, Cloud Drive auto launch. So I'm looking through the list. Since they're all false, I'm actually looking through the setting names, and I find Cloud Drive auto launch, hit add to policy. So there's a couple of tips on how to effectively search and filter this, just because, again, really long list. It would take forever to actually look through this. Let's actually set something as firm-wide. So I'm going to do Cloud Drive letter. There's our Cloud Drive letter, which is set to A. Again, all we do is click add to policy. And you'll notice, when I click that, it doesn't actually like pop up and say added to policy or, give us really any confirmation that it was added to the policy. So the way that we can verify that we did set that is to go to the second tab up here that says policy settings. So there's my settings, which will show you a list of all the settings and your value for them, where you can actually add them to the policy. And then there's policy settings, which will show you all of the settings that you or anyone else at your firm has configured for this specific group, in this case, our global policies. So we click on policy settings and we see Cloud Drive letter, A. Yes, it is configured as firm-wide since I clicked on the pencil icon next to global instead of groups. So also important to remember which group you're configuring settings for. That probably goes without saying, but just thought I'd mention it. So on this tab here, there are a couple of things we can do, which you may or may not do at some point. Basically, on the left, we have a column that says enabled, and we can just actually uncheck this box to temporarily disable this firm-wide setting or this group policy, depending on where we are. This would be useful if you just want to turn it off temporarily and you're planning on turning it back on at some point. If we just uncheck the box, it will remain here under policy settings, and we will not have to search for it again under my settings. So it'll just stay here. We can come back later, recheck the box to enable it. Now, if we instead want to permanently remove it from our group or from our firm, then we can use this remove button on the right-hand side, and that will actually permanently remove it here. And if we wanted to add it back, we would have to find it again under my settings and click add to policy again, which I will go ahead and do right now. So that's really all you can do on this screen, is just review which ones are firm-wide or group-wide, temporarily turn them off, or permanently remove them. But once we've configured everything that we want to set for this group, we just hit save and close on the policy editor, and then save and close on our settings window. And within 60 minutes, that will load out to everyone. So group settings are basically the same. And again, I click save and close without actually configuring any settings for those groups. So you'll see it did empty it out here again. But normally what we would do is, as soon as we make the group, we would click the pencil icon and set some settings for that group. That way, when we hit save and close here, it saves those settings to that group. We hit save and close, and then that is basically permanently locked in. Other people can go in and select that for their group. Fairly straightforward, I guess, on how to set this stuff. It's just, it can be a little bit little bit overwhelming at first when you see that big long list of settings. So let's go ahead and see if there are any questions. First question here is, can people be members of more than one group? So unfortunately, they cannot. Each user will have to select one specific group that they should be in. If we were to configure multiple groups for the same user, there would just be a lot of conflicts. And really, I would just recommend breaking up into more groups or setting things that should be covering like multiple groups. You know, if you're to the point where you want to configure a bunch of different groups of settings and then assign them to specific people, you're probably being too specific with the settings that you're configuring for groups. And I would recommend just making them more vague and then having some settings that each person just goes in and configures on their own, or you know, make more specific groups, I guess, for smaller groups of users. But unfortunately, we can only assign one group to a person. I'm going to pause here for just a few seconds and see if any other questions pop up. It looks like we had just the one. We do have another question here. The question is, can anyone make changes to the global settings? So technically, yes. Anyone could go into settings, go to advanced, go to group policies, and actually configure these settings. We don't have like administrators or anything like that for your Faster Suite license. So anyone can go in here and actually configure these settings. Now, most people wouldn't know how. So it's usually not really, I guess, a problem. You know, we haven't run into that very often where people are going in and changing firm-wide settings just because no one really even knows they're here unless they are specifically looking for it. Now, if you run into a situation where like your firm-wide settings have changed and you know you didn't do it and you're the only one that should be doing that, let us know. We can help you find out who actually made those changes. We can find your previous settings, set everything back, and basically get you a name so you can, I don't know, reprimand that person, say, hey, don't do that. But again, it's not something that we've really run into, but let us know if it does and we can help you out. I'll pause for just a moment here again. So another question did pop up. It's is the only way to change the value of a global setting or group setting by setting your settings, then updating the global or group? Correct. So in order to actually configure settings for a group or for the firm, you do have to make the change to your settings first. So if you are configuring settings for a specific group that you don't belong to, you will have to change your settings to how that group should have their settings, and then change them back after you've configured those settings. Now, what we would normally recommend is just have someone from that group set their settings as firm-wide, or just hop onto one of their computers and take their settings and load them to that group, just because, you know, it probably doesn't make sense for you to be setting other groups' settings anyway. Just have someone from that group set them. If they don't know how, then again, hop on their computer and just configure it for their group since they already have those settings set. So Wendy, you said you might want to create a group for admin or something to easily set your stuff back to what it was. Yeah, you could do that. You could just create a group for yourself, set your settings there, then go to the other group, set those settings in your settings, load them out, and then just switch back to admin and load settings now, and that would set your settings back. You are correct. So that is a good idea. I hadn't thought of that. But yep, that answers your question, it looks like. Any others? I will pause here for just a moment again, since they seem to be kind of just trickling in. All right, well, no other questions are coming in. Again, fairly short for our webinars here, so that's kind of nice. That was easy. You know, go set your group settings. You'll do great. It'll be a lot easier in the future. So a couple other things that I always mention. If you want to install a trial of Faster Suite, if you're not currently using it and you like what you saw today, fasterlaw.com/download is where you can go to install a 7-day fully featured free trial of FasterSuite. So go ahead and try it out. I'm sure you're going to like it. The webinar archive. If you missed any portion of today's webinar or any of our previous webinars, you can always check our webinar archive at this URL. We basically, the day of a webinar, later that day, we get it loaded up there, just a copy of the video, so you can go back and review it, catch it if you didn't see it when we were live, anything like that. This is where they'll be stored. Also, if any questions come in related to the webinar after the webinar is done, we'll post them in the webinar archive and answer those questions there. If you like FasterSuite, if you like these webinars, tell your friends. I'm sure they'll thank you. You know, if you know someone that's not using FasterSuite or you know someone that's not attending the webinars, let them know. I'm sure they will appreciate it. And for anything related to the webinars or anything at all in general, contact us at help@fasterlaw.com. We'd love to help in any way that we can. So anything related to FasterSuite, related to the webinars, anything at all for FasterLaw, let us know. Help@fasterlaw.com is the best way to email us. Let's take a look at what's coming up. So next week is February 26th. The topic for next week's webinar is maximize your Clio efficiency. So this is going to be, really we're going to cover some of the less commonly used features in FasterSuite. Some of them are kind of niche features that, you know, some firms use really heavily and a lot of firms don't. But we just want to cover some of these things that you might not know about, just to make sure you're getting the most out of FasterSuite and Clio and just using your time effectively, getting as much work done as possible. So definitely check that out if you want to see if there's more you can get out of FasterSuite. The following week, March 4th, there is no webinar. I'll be out of the office visiting family in Florida. So, you know, make sure you don't just pop in here on that day expecting to see something. There will be no webinar. But the following week, March 11th, this is going to be a fun one. You've heard me mention it the last couple of weeks. It's the FasterLaw Ask Me Anything with Tony, Josh, and myself. So Tony, our CEO and founder, he will be answering questions. Josh, our VP of Strategic Partnerships and Channel, will be answering questions as well. I will be there in a hosting capacity, but you can also ask me questions if you would like. So that should be a fun one. Definitely check that one out. Should be a good time and very informational for everyone involved. But that's it. So thanks for attending. Again, today was episode 10, sharing your settings through group policies. Definitely check back next week and you know, every week, every Wednesday. But with that, this is Andrew Suter signing off. Thanks for coming, everyone. You have a good rest of the day. Bye.